everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling something I think we all struggle with. Those pesky thoughts that just won't quit. You know, the ones that keep you up at night, make you second guess everything, and just make life feel, well, harder. We're going deep on an article called How to Get Your Mind Off Something. Face it, don't distract yourself. And I think the title itself is pretty interesting, because usually we're told to distract ourselves, right? But this article flips that idea on its head. It suggests we actually befriend those thoughts instead of trying to fight them off.
It really is a fascinating concept. Kind of challenges that ingrained instinct we have to just shove those thoughts away.
Totally. So before we even get to the how-to of befriending our thoughts, let's unpack why we even want to get our minds off things in the first place. What's driving that urge? Is it just me? Or does it feel like our brains are kind of wired to focus on the negative stuff?
Oh, you're definitely not alone there. And there's actually a reason for that negativity bias. From like an evolutionary standpoint, it made sense to focus on potential threats, get us safe. But these days, that same wiring can lead to a whole lot of unnecessary stress.
Right. It's like our brains are stuck in survival mode, even when we're not in any real danger. So what do we usually do when those thoughts start swirling around?
Well, we try to distract ourselves, right?
Right.
Scrolling through social media, binge watching shows, maybe even burying ourselves in work. And hey, sometimes.
Yeah.
A little distraction is exactly what we need. But like this article points out, distraction often just offers temporary relief.
Yeah, it's like they're playing whack-a-mole in our brains.
Exactly. And those thoughts, they tend to come back, sometimes even stronger.
Ugh. Okay, so why doesn't distraction work in the long run then? What's happening under the surface?
Because we're basically training our brains to avoid discomfort. Think of it this way. Every time you push a thought away, you're kind of reinforcing that it's something to be feared. And paradoxically, the more we resist those thoughts, the more they seem to persist.
A vicious cycle. So what's the alternative? How do we actually befriend these thoughts?
This is where it gets really interesting. This article suggests that instead of viewing our thoughts as enemies, we should see them more like messengers. They're trying to tell us something important. Imagine like a scared child crying for attention. If you ignore them, their cries are just going to get louder. But if you approach them with compassion and try to understand what's wrong, you can actually help them calm down and feel safe.
Okay, that's a powerful analogy. But how do we apply that to our thoughts? Like, it feels strange to be compassionate towards something that's causing me stress.
I get that. And it's super important to remember that befriending a thought doesn't mean you like it or that you agree with it. It's more about approaching it with curiosity and understanding, almost like you would a friend who's going through a tough time.
Okay, starting to see the logic here. But wouldn't listening to my anxieties just make them worse?
Actually, a lot of research suggests the opposite. Avoidance can actually feed anxiety. Engaging with your thoughts mindfully can actually help reduce their intensity. It's like holding them up to the light and realizing they're not as scary as they seemed in the shadows.
All right, so how do we actually put this into practice?
Well, the article lays out a simple 4-step exercise. But before we get into the steps, maybe you, the listener, have a few thoughts on what you've heard so far. What stands out to you? What feels the most challenging?
Yeah, take a moment to reflect. We'll dive into those steps right after this.
Welcome back. As we were talking before, I was thinking about how counterintuitive this whole idea of befriending our thoughts feels. It's like we've been conditioned to believe that we need to fight those negative thoughts. Yeah. To conquer them. But maybe, just maybe, there's a gentler, more compassionate way to approach them. Yeah, I think you're onto something. That fight or flight response is so deeply ingrained in us, and it can be really tough to rewire those automatic reactions. What if, instead of seeing those thoughts as adversaries, we saw them as parts of ourselves that are hurting and need our attention?
It's like we're extending a hand of friendship instead of raising our fists. But in a practical sense, what does that even look like?
Well, this article suggests a 4-step exercise to help us get started. And it all begins with something that might sound deceptively simple, pausing and breathing.
Okay, so before we even address the thought itself, we're taking a moment to just be present, to ground ourselves.
Exactly. It's about creating a space of stillness, a pause in that constant chatter of our minds. I mean, the breath is such a powerful tool for this. Just taking a few deep, conscious breaths can actually shift our entire physiological state. It sends a signal to our nervous system that we're safe, that we can slow down.
It's like hitting the pause button on that fight or flight response.
Yeah.
Okay, but then what? Do we just try to ignore the thought once we've calmed down a bit?
Actually, no. The next step is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all. Invite the thought in. Instead of resisting it, acknowledge its presence. You can even say to yourself, okay, I hear you, I'm listening.
Wow, that's so different from how we usually react, right? We tend to clench up, try to push it away.
Yeah.
Maybe even berate ourselves for having the thought in the first place.
Right, but imagine if you did that to a friend who was confiding in you about their struggles. You wouldn't tell them to just shut up and pretend everything was fine, would you?
Of course not. You would listen, offer support, try to understand their perspective.
Exactly, and that's the kind of compassion we're aiming to cultivate towards ourselves. It's about creating a safe space within for all our thoughts and feelings, even the messy ones.
Okay, I'm getting this. So we pause, we breathe, we invite the thought in, and then what? Do we try to analyze it, figure out where it came from?
That can be helpful, but the article suggests something even simpler. Write it out.
Interesting. So we're not just thinking about the thought. We're actually giving it a voice, putting it into words.
Right, and there's something really powerful about externalizing a thought. It's almost like it loses some of its power when it's no longer just swirling around in our heads.
I can see that. It's like when you're venting to a friend. Just getting it out there can be incredibly relieving.
And this practice of expressive writing has actually been studied quite a bit. Research has shown that it can be incredibly beneficial for processing emotions, reducing stress, and even improving physical health.
Wow. So there's real science backing this up. But what about those thoughts that are really persistent? The ones that just keep coming back no matter how much we try to reason with them?
That's where the fourth and final step comes in.
Yeah.
And it might be the most challenging of all. Respond with compassion.
Okay, so we're not just acknowledging the thought. We're actively offering it kindness and understanding.
Imagine you're talking to a scared child.
Yeah.
You wouldn't dismiss their fears or tell them to just get over it. You'd offer comfort, reassurance, maybe even a hug.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. But wouldn't that just reinforce the thought, make it stronger?
Actually, research suggests the opposite. When we meet our thoughts with compassion, we're activating a different part of our brain, the part associated with soothing and self-regulation. It's like we're calming down the nervous system's alarm bells.
Okay, so we're essentially rewiring our brains to respond to those thoughts differently. We're shifting from fear and resistance to understanding and acceptance. But I have to ask, is it really possible to befriend every thought? What about those thoughts that are truly harmful or destructive?
That's a great question. And I think it's important to make a distinction here. This approach is not about condoning harmful behavior or ignoring red flags. If you're having thoughts that are putting you or others at risk, it's absolutely crucial to seek professional help.
Right. This is about learning to manage those everyday anxieties and worries, the ones that can make life feel overwhelming, but aren't necessarily indicative of a serious mental health issue.
Exactly. This is about cultivating a more peaceful relationship with our own minds.
Okay, so we've walked through the 4 steps. And I have to say, this whole concept is starting to feel less intimidating and more like a powerful tool for self-care. But I'm curious, is there any scientific evidence to suggest that this actually works?
There absolutely is.
Yeah.
This whole approach is rooted in mindfulness practices,
Yeah.
which have been studied extensively and shown to have a wide range of benefits, from reducing anxiety and depression to improving focus and emotional regulation.
So we're not just talking about feel-good fluff here. There's actual neuroscience behind this. Can you tell us a little more about how mindfulness impacts our brains?
Well, one key finding is that mindfulness practices actually change the structure of our brains. Studies have shown that regular mindfulness meditation can increase gray matter in areas of the brain associated with self-awareness, compassion, and emotional regulation.
Wow, so we're literally rewiring our brains for the better.
Exactly. And that's not all. Mindfulness has also been shown to reduce activity in the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that processes fear and anxiety.
So we're calming down that inner alarm system and creating more space for peace and clarity.
Precisely. And the more we practice these techniques, the more ingrained those neural pathways become. It's like building a muscle. The more we use it, the stronger it gets.
This is fascinating. But I imagine this is not something that happens overnight. It takes time and effort to cultivate this new way of relating to our thoughts.
Absolutely. Befriending your thoughts is a journey, not a destination. There will be days when it feels easy and natural, and days when it feels incredibly challenging.
So it's about being patient with ourselves.
Yeah.
About recognizing that this is a process.
Exactly. And the key is to approach it with curiosity and self-compassion. Instead of judging yourself for having those unwanted thoughts, simply observe them, acknowledge their presence, and offer yourself the same kindness you would offer a friend.
This has been such an insightful conversation, but before we go too much further, Let's take a quick moment to let all this sink in. When we come back, we'll explore how this idea of befriending our thoughts connects to a concept called radical acceptance, and how we can integrate these practices into our everyday lives. Stay with us. Welcome back. As we've been talking about befriending our thoughts, I keep thinking about how much our culture emphasizes positive thinking. It's almost like we're discouraged from acknowledging anything that's less than sunshine and rainbows.
Yeah, it's true. We're constantly bombarded with messages telling us to look on the bright side and to just be happy. And while those sentiments can be helpful sometimes, they can also create this pressure to suppress our true emotions. It's like we're not allowed to be human,
Right. It's like we're supposed to be these perfectly polished versions of ourselves all the time, and that just doesn't feel authentic.
Not at all. And that pressure to be positive all the time can actually backfire. When we try to force ourselves to feel a certain way, we're essentially denying our own experiences. And those unacknowledged emotions, well, they don't just disappear. They tend to kind of fester and grow stronger.
It's like we're creating an internal battleground where we're constantly fighting against ourselves.
Exactly. And that's where the concept of radical acceptance comes in. The article mentions it briefly, but I think it's worth exploring a little further. It's about embracing all parts of ourselves, even the messy, uncomfortable parts.
Okay, so it's not about pretending those thoughts and feelings aren't there. It's about acknowledging their presence without judgment.
Exactly. It's about saying yes to our experience, even when it's difficult. And I know the word radical can sound kind of intense, but it's really about a deep, unwavering kindness towards ourselves.
It's like saying, hey, I see you, I hear you, and I'm not going to abandon you even when you're struggling.
Beautifully put. And, this idea of radical acceptance is closely tied to mindfulness. It's about observing our thoughts and feelings without getting caught up in the storyline, without labeling them as good or bad.
So it's about creating space for those thoughts and emotions to exist without letting them control us.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that acceptance doesn't mean resignation. It's not about giving up or letting those thoughts run our lives. It's about acknowledging their presence and choosing how we respond to them.
This has been so eye-opening. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can actually integrate this idea of befriending our thoughts into our daily lives. It's one thing to understand it intellectually, but how do we make it a practice?
That's a great question. And I think the key is to start small. Maybe you begin by incorporating a few minutes of mindfulness meditation into your day, or perhaps you start a journaling practice where you can explore your thoughts and feelings without judgment.
Those are great ideas. And, even something as simple as taking a few deep breaths when you feel overwhelmed can make a huge difference. It's about creating those little pauses throughout the day to reconnect with ourselves.
And remember, this is a journey, not a destination. There will be days when it feels easy and days when it feels incredibly challenging. Be patient with yourself and celebrate your progress along the way.
I love that. It's about recognizing that we're all works in progress, and that's okay. So as we wrap up, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think it comes back to that idea of radical acceptance. What if, instead of trying to get our minds off something, we allowed ourselves to get our minds on something?
Ooh, I like that. What do you mean?
What if we approached those unwanted thoughts with curiosity instead of fear? What if we saw them as opportunities for self-discovery rather than enemies to be defeated?
That's a powerful reframe. It's like we're being invited to become explorers of our own inner landscapes.
And who knows what treasures we might uncover along the way. Perhaps we'll find hidden strengths, unexpected insights, or a deeper understanding of ourselves.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you've gained some valuable tools and feel empowered to start befriending your thoughts. Remember, it's a practice, it's a journey, and you don't have to do it alone. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.